Hello and welcome to my project announcement video. My name is Catherine and I have decided to try my hand at documenting in video form the process of making an Arcadian Shepherdess costume. One driving force for making this costume is that I intend to enter the upcoming Foundations Revealed contest. I'll put a link below to the website. The theme for the contest in 2020 is renewal. In my mind, renewal conjures up images of spring, blooming blossoms, and new life, perhaps something tranquil, idyllic, and rejuvenating. So, I have decided to make an 18th century inspired Arcadian shepherdess outfit, as I think a frolicking shepherdess feels the right way to go with this theme. I'm taking inspiration from paintings and porcelain of the 18th and 19th century. I also adore this Limoges jug. I bought this little jug direct from the factory when I visited in 2003, and I think the time has come to bring this delightful little shepherdess to life. As I am aiming for a moderately historical outfit with this project, I've decided to use commercial patterns from sources that I trust. Although I will say here and now, this will not be a historical practice project. I do not intend to sew the whole thing by hand. I will be building this project from the base up. I will start with American Duchess's Simplicity 8162 18th century underpinnings sewing pattern for the chemise and bum pad. I will construct my stays using Redthreaded's 1780s front lacing stays pattern. For the outer dress, I will use American Duchess's Simplicity 8161 18th century costume pattern. There is a further theme to the Foundations Revealed contest that encourages entrants to consider sustainability, recycling, and upcycling. As such, I will endeavour, as much as possible, to use materials from my stash for this project. I do have quite a collection of fabric. Some is leftover from previous projects, some is hand-me-downs from other people, some I have bought just thinking it would be useful one day, or too pretty to resist. I also have project boxes of particular projects that I'm working on, some of which are quite long-term, but I'm sure I'll get there in the end. For this project, I have gone through my stash and found some cotton voile for my floofy underthings, the chemise as well as an under-petticoat. I have a beautiful yellowy gold and ivory brocade for the stays. I also have a pink brocade for a related project that may make an appearance. I have lots of white herringbone tape, a few other bits of tape, and a selection of ribbons. For the outer dress, I have a wool blend with some delightful sparkly bits, which I bought as a treat for myself for my birthday some years ago. I plan to pair that with this lovely ivory satin. I don't quite have enough of that for the whole petticoat, but I'll be able to work around that, as the back of the petticoat won't be visible under the overdress. And then I have some beautiful gold lace for the decoration. With my materials and patterns in mind, I have sketched up a little design of how I think my Arcadian shepherdess will look when she is finished. So please join me on this little adventure into 18th century attire as I create my own Arcadian shepherdess ensemble. Feel free to subscribe to ensure you are notified as the videos come out. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time. Welcome to the first sewing video in my Arcadian Shepherdess series. My plan is to build from the base up, so we're starting with the chemise. I have previously made a few underdresses and shifts for other projects, but not quite the sort of thing I need for this one. A shape and ruffle delight using non-stretch fabric, in this case a light cotton voile. I used American Duchess's Simplicity 8162 18th century underpinnings sewing pattern for this project. I did vary it slightly by adding an extra ruffle along the bottom edge.
We start by cutting out the pattern pieces so that we can use them to cut out the actual pieces. We have the front, the back, the neck ruffle, the neck facing, the sleeve gusset, and a sleeve ruffle. Laying out the cotton voile on the fold, you see me here using pattern weights to weigh down the pattern for the back as well as the ruffle. I'm cutting out the back with a little bit of extra room just to be sure, and then cutting out the ruffle. Not shown here, the front is cut out in the same manner as the back. Moving on to the facing piece, which is cut on the bias, as well as the sleeve and sleeve ruffle. Before I start the real construction of the garment, I do some stay stitching around the neckline. Stay stitching stops the fabric from moving around and stretching when you're handling it. So firstly, I stitched around the back, and then I repeated the process on the front half, stitching around the neckline of the front. Next, I pinned the shoulders together on each side, back to front. And then joined the shoulders using the overlocker. So one benefit of using an overlocker is it then means the seam is fully contained and you don't need to do any other finishing. So it not only sews the seam, but keeps it all nice and neat. As these seams are not the final seams, I just tie them off so that it doesn't fray, as opposed to doing any real finishing.
So now both bits are joined at the shoulder, and we have stay stitching around the neck.
Next, we join together the individual pieces of the neck ruffle so that it becomes one big loop. Once the seams have been joined on the overlocker, we then top stitch them down on the sewing machine so that they sit nice and flat. Then, in this big giant loop, I stitch along 4mm lines for gathering. So here you can see it all going round and round and round. Once the first line of gathering stitches is complete, I do a second line that's parallel to them. Once the gather lines are prepared, we now deal with the other side, and to hem I'm using the rolled hem on the overlocker. So this is the machine version of a rolled hem. I have to have right side of the fabric up because the machine rolls the fabric down. And I realised that actually I probably shouldn't have sewn my pieces together, as doing the rolled hem couldn't actually go through where the seams were connected. But oh well, we all make mistakes. And apart from that little issue, I'm really happy with how the little rolled edges look. And then, as this is the finished bottom edge of the neck ruffle, I use a needle to thread in the loose ends. I then pinned and top stitched those sections over the seams where I wasn't able to use the rolled edge. So on the left, we can see the main body of the chemise, the front and the back that are stitched together at the shoulders. And on the right is the ruffle. I gathered up the ruffle using those gather laying lines we put in, trying to get it down to the size of the neckline. And then pinning it to the chemise. And letting the floof begin. We are now stitching down the neck ruffle onto the neckline of the chemise using a 2mm stitch. It is getting a little bit cumbersome and hard to wrangle at this stage. Back at the pinning board, I attach the neck facing over the ruffle. So we're putting right sides together, pinning it along. And just working all the way around. And there we are, all pinned. Next is, you guessed it, sewing it on. So this neck facing is not only going to encase the seam of both the ruffle and the neck of the chemise, but also be the channel that the drawstring goes through, so that we're able to pull it all nice and tight, or to whatever size we want. So now the facing is attached on one side to the neck and the ruffle. And what we need to do is pin it down, fold it over and pin it down with the edge tucked underneath so that everything is nice and secured inside. And then stitch that down as well. So it's starting to actually look a bit garmenty. Pretty ruffles going on everywhere, not just crazy floof. Well, okay, it's still quite crazy floof. So you can see the line being sewn down, creating a nice channel for the neck drawstring to go to. Then, to get that ribbon into the channel, put a safety pin through one end to give you something to grip in, and feed that through all the way round. Although I realised I'd actually put the wrong ribbon in, but that's okay. It's easy enough to attach the correct ribbon to the end and just pull it all through. Progress review time. Here we can see the chemise on Madam, my dummy. The front and the back is together and the neckline is all done. Overall, we're about halfway through. And while it's not in the pattern, I have decided to add a ruffle along the bottom edge. I want the ruffle to be 6 inches wide, and as I want 4 pieces in it, I cut 24 inches across my fabric. To make the cutting out easier, I fold them over so that I'm going to minimize how many times I cut through. Straightening up the edges and cutting each section of the ruffle. Next, let's deal with more of these edges, going back to the machine rolled hem, doing both the long pieces of the bottom ruffle. Yes, this time I've learnt and I'm not joining them up first. And then I also did the edges of the sleeve ruffles as well. Now that all the edging is done, I'm converting the overlocker back to its cutting mode. So putting in the extra needle and putting the blade up. Threading the needle. Next, I join all 4 of those bottom ruffle pieces together so that it makes one big loop, taking care that it doesn't have any twists in it. And taking a look at what we've just done, at the top we have the sleeve ruffles. So they each have a rolled edge. Then down below, the big long bottom ruffle, also with its lovely long rolled edge, and all 4 panels are joined together. Now we can assemble the sleeves. The sleeve gussets are pinned onto the sleeves, and I used the pattern pieces just to check the alignment of how things are meant to be. Then we use the overlocker to join the gussets onto the sleeve, being careful to go very slowly even though this is sped up, and make sure we do not get any pins under the overlocker. So there we have sleeves with gussets. Back to the ruffles. It's time to put the gathering stitches along the top edges of both the sleeve ruffles as well as the big bottom ruffle. Firstly, I put 1 line of stitching in, and then a second line parallel to it. Then you pull on the 2 threads to bring in the gather of each sleeve ruffle, getting it to the right size for the sleeve. Nice and even, and pinning it on. This is then repeated for the second sleeve ruffle. Then the sleeve ruffles are sewn down on the sewing machine, so we're joining the gathered ruffle onto the flat sleeve. And then, being nice and attached and with the pins all gone, it's very quick to overlock the 2, adding another 2 lines of stitching to keep it secure and bind the edge. So from the outside, nice and neat. The main body of the chemise is laid out open, and the sleeve with the gussets on either side is pinned to the main body. This can then be overlocked together. And the procedure is repeated on the other side. So we're getting a bit of a big plus sign forming with the back, the front, and the 2 sides of the sleeves. back to the overlocker to join that second sleeve on. And now the time has come to join the sides together. So the chemise is wrong sides out, and we're pinning from the cuff of the sleeve, then the ruffle, and then all the way along the sleeve, and the gusset, and then down the side. This is then joined together at the overlocker. And then that process is repeated again on the other side. Okay, we're so close now. Time for more of that gathering the ruffle, which you're probably quite familiar with. This time on the quite long bottom ruffle, and it does take a fair bit of time to bring it all in and bringing each quarter to meet a quarter of the chemise bottom edge length. Once it is all down to about the right size, it's time to lay it onto the chemise, and because I have the ruffle, I don't want the chemise the full length that we cut it out to, so I'm placing it up above the edge of the cut of the fabric. And continuing round, pinning all the way along. And once again, that same ruffly process. Sewing down the ruffle onto the chemise at the sewing machine. And then going in from the edge, and there we are, now binding that seam that we just did on the sewing machine on the overlocker, going all the way around the bottom of the chemise.
So here we are. I'm very happy with my new chemise. Fits quite well, although I don't know if I did need to add in all that extra room. But it comes in at the neckline, so it doesn't matter. Thank you for watching this first step in my Arcadian Shepherdess project. I hope you'll join me next time when I move on to the stays. Hello and welcome to my next video in my Arcadian Shepherdess sewing series. In this video, I look at how I make my mock-up for my 1780s front lacing stays. I'm using Redthreaded's pattern for these stays, and before I started on the mock-up, I printed out the pattern on paper at 1/4 scale to have a little play to see how the pieces go together. There are 4 pieces per half of the stays: the front panel, the side panel, the back panel, as well as a strap.
After cutting out the full-size paper pattern pieces, I cut off a piece of denim fabric big enough to cut each pattern piece 4 times. That's 2 sides, each having an outer and a lining. I then realised that the denim was so thick that I should only use it for the strength layer, and decided to use a thinner fabric for the lining. So I folded my fabric in half and laid out the pattern pieces. Using a ruler to keep on the straight grain, I pinned the pieces onto the straight grain using 2 pins per piece. As well as the 2 pins on the grain line, I hold the pattern pieces down with weights. And then can cut out the pieces. I used a tracing wheel with carbon paper to mark the notches and waist tabs on the wrong side of the strength layer.
I'm happy with that. And once you've done it on one side, you've got the line to follow on the other.
And then I labelled each piece. So here we are. I have cut out all my outer pieces and marked the notches and waist tabs and labelled each piece. So we have the stomacher, the front piece, the side piece, the back piece, and the strap. Then I repeated the process for the lining layer using a lighter fabric. I laid out the pattern pieces and cut them out. Then this time, I transferred the marks of the boning channels with carbon paper and tracing wheel. This was my first time using the tracing wheel, and I found it very tough on my hands and wrists. So this is where we're up to. I have cut both the outer and the lining sections of the mock-up of my stays. So let's take a closer look. We have the stomacher and the front section, and you can see the lines that I have traced through with the tracing wheel and paper. The next thing to do is stay stitching the tabs. This is sewing along the wrong side of the strength layer, following the markings that we made with the tracing wheel. And having to lift the foot by hand as we went round the tabs reminded me that I do have a knee lever. It is useful when you have to lift the foot a lot, so that will come into play shortly.
So anyway, there's the wrong side of the fabric, and it's all come nicely through onto the right side. Yay!
This process is repeated for the other 3 pieces that have tabs, the backs and the sides. And the next step is to start the stays assembly, sewing to the sides on both the strength layer and the lining. They're sewn at 3/8 of an inch, which is pretty much 10 millimeters. For the thick denim, I warmed it when closed, then finger pressed it open to get it started, and used the iron to press open. Also ironing on the right side. The lining pieces can be pressed open straight away. Then I laid out the folders, right sides up, and flipped the linings over to arrange the 2 halves right sides together. I matched the side seams and the centre fronts and pinned. Then the centre seam was sewn with a 1-inch seam allowance. I pressed the centre front seam open using the same process of warming it up, then pressing open with fingers, then ironing it. Then I pressed in half so that the wrong sides are together and the centre front edge is bagged out. When laid next to each other, it's really starting to look like something. Because I actually want to also put lacing on the centre back, as well as the centre front, I'm going to deviate slightly from the instruction and bag out the back seams and insert lacing strips for this mock-up. So here the seams are pinned and ready to sew. They're then sewn with 5/8 of an inch of seam allowance. I return to the ironing board and press the seam open, then bag out. And I do this for both sides. It's time for the boning channels. I decided to firstly pin the layers together at the side front seam and sew that seam down. Then I top stitch along the front edge with a short 1.5mm stitch. Then a line further along where I'll sew on the lacing strips. And then we're onto the slightly tricky section of going around and around and around, following along all the lines of the panels, pivoting at intersections to ensure that we don't sew over any of the boning channels of neither the vertical or horizontal bones. And you might be able to tell I've got my knee lift in now, so I can use the hands on the sewing. For this mock-up, I just backstitch to tie off my ends, and I'm not really concerned about making it look pretty, but that will be done very differently for the real version. And onto the back piece. I top stitch along the back edge And I initially ignore the lines that we've traced on because we're also using lacing strips on this edge. I sew in one boning channel at the back as my lacing strips are a bit short, and sew the line 3 centimeters from the edge. That will be where I sew on the lacing strip. Then I continue sewing along the marked lines as we did for the piece. We want these boning channels a good centimetre wide. The stomacher is sewn with the wrong sides together, in the middle and working out. Then a line of top stitching is sewn around the bottom of the stomacher to ensure that the bones stay in. All the bone channels are sewn, and this is getting very exciting. It's definitely starting to look like some stays. So the next step is to attach the back panels. So they're pinned together and then sewn together. And the body is assembled. We're now ready to add the lacing strips for this mock-up. The front lacing strips, which are made with 2 flat steel bones either side of grommets, are pinned on. Note that they are offset for spiral lacing, and then sewn down. Then the process repeated for the back lacing strips. This time the lacing is already done up, so I'm pinning to both sides at once. Then, using a long stitch and no back stitching, the lacing strips are sewn down. And we're getting so close now. It's really like stays, and we're ready to insert the boning. I used synthetic whalebone. I started by cutting the bones to size for the stomacher. I used the wider 12-metre wide bone for the stomacher centre front, and the narrower, the 6mm wide bone for the main section as well as the rest of the stays. It is a long, slow process, which is not framed, sorry. Then onto the stays, starting at the left and working right. I measure the channels, cut them to size, trim, file and insert. Cutting is fairly easy with scissors, although it does rather shatter, and then the corners also with scissors and file with an emery board. Synthetic whalebone is a modern polymer that closely resembles the characteristics of actual baleen. I will link a couple of articles that discuss it in the description. And I bought my boning from So Curvy. The main body of the stays took 1 hour and 45 minutes. We have all the bones in. Hurrah! So in the stomacher, we are done, ready to try on for this mock-up. Over on the main piece, we still have to sew along the bottom around the tabs so we can cut out the tabs and attach the shoulder pieces. So that's what we're doing next. I'm not actually binding the tabs for this mock-up, just stitching around where such binding would go. I will do the actual tab binding on the real thing. Using a short 1.5mm stitch length, I sew across the bottom of the stays, following around parallel to the sewn guidelines. While stitching the first half, I realised I should be using a zipper foot, so I switched over for the second half. And that was indeed better. I sewed on the straps, which for this mock-up is just the strength layer. Then on to trimming the tabs. I wasn't being too precise, just cutting around the area. The main thing is to make sure you cut high enough so that the tabs or skirts can open out fully. I pinned the back pieces to be 2 inches apart. And I adjusted the back lacing panel to have a 2-inch lacing gap. I joined the straps to the front with a ribbon by simply snipping a hole with scissors and threading the ribbon through. The moment of truth, actually trying on the mock-up. It does take a little while and a bit of fiddle to go around and around and around with the ribbon, but eventually I got there. It was a great cut, but just too large, even when lacing everything closed.
So here we have them, the mock-up of my 1780s front lacing stays. Of course, I chose to lace them up not only at the front, but also at the back. A few things occur to me now that I've made these. Firstly, that this is an excellent pattern, and if you're looking for this sort of stays, I can highly recommend Redthreaded's pattern. Secondly, that this pair is just too large, and I think I want to get a smaller size, because not only do I want to be able to lace down a bit tighter, at the moment the back of the stays are fully laced closed, and I want to be able to have a gap to allow for fluctuations. So definitely want to go smaller. And the third minor thing to keep in mind is that I've got to be careful sewing on the straps to make sure they get nice and flat for the final ones. So thank you for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed the mock-up process of my 1780s front lacing stays. Please join me next time when I move on to the real thing. Hello and welcome to the next video in my Arcadian Shepherdess sewing series. To make these stays, I used Redthreaded 1780s front lacing stays pattern. I have a previous video where I made a mock-up of the process. In these stays, I use 2 layers of soft herringbone coutil for my strength layers, as well as a fashion fabric of a lovely brocade, which I think worked really well. It's an amazing pattern, and I'm really excited to be able to share this process with you.
This part 1 video is on the preparation of the pieces. We will cover preparing the paper pattern pieces, cutting out the fabric, marking the pieces such as the notches and the bone channels, flatlining the brocade to the coutil, and stay stitching the tabs. I started by cutting out the paper pattern pieces, as I did for the mock-up, only this time I cut them out twice. For the front and the back, I taped the 2 pieces together at the centre front and centre back respectively, as I want to cut the fabric such that both coutil layers are one piece, without needing to cut on the fold. Similarly for the stomacher, I cut 2 versions of the pattern, leaving a margin on one half. Then I join the 2 pieces together so that the stomacher will be able to be cut out in one without being cut on the fold. Then I cut out 2 straps and all the pieces were prepared. Next, I roughly laid out the paper pattern pieces on the coutil. And cut off the amount needed. I pressed the coutil with steam and then folded it neatly in half and pressed on the fold. I also heavily steamed the brocade twice, as I was following the general advice of treat your fabric as you will the garment, and I did not pre-wash the brocade as the stays would not be washed. I had hoped this would be sufficient to account for shrinkage, but as you will see, it was not. Next, I pinned the pattern pieces to the coutil. I laid out the pieces, then ensured they were on grain by using a long ruler matched up with the lines on the cutting board. I measured and pinned 2 points on the grain line of each piece, then added other pins to hold the pattern flat. Then I cut out the coutil. Note that I'm not cutting up all the way up the tabs at the bottom in order to minimize fraying due to handling during the sewing process. I steam the front pieces on the fold. I warm them with the iron first, then finger press, then iron. And I repeat this for the back pieces as well. I labelled the front pieces on the wrong side, writing front wrong side on each outer piece and front lining wrong side on the lining. Weighing the paper pattern down with weights, I used a tracing wheel and graphite paper to trace the notches and lines onto the wrong sides of the outer pieces. I repeat the process for the back pieces, where the lines go around the tabs. And I go through the process for the side pieces as well. Note that there are 4 separate pieces, as these are not on the fold. Now for the boning channels. Starting with the stomacher, the boning channels are marked onto the right sides of the lining pieces. As I did in the mock-up, I marked the half with the paper pattern right side up first of all. Then you followed the perforations when marking out the second half. I also marked the boning channels on the side pieces, the front lining pieces, and then the back lining pieces. So here we can see all the marked boning channels. I laid out the brocade wrong side up and pinned it down to hold it in place. Thankfully, you can see the pattern from the wrong side and you can see the cutting board lines through the fabric as well. I laid out the couture pieces over the top, being careful to get the swirls of the pattern where I wanted them, and pinned the couture in place. I was rather nervous, as while I have had some success with fusing on a fashion fabric, this was my first time flatlining. I turned my attention to the first front piece, pinning it securely to the brocade, and then cutting with plenty of seam allowance. I stitch about 1/4 inch from the edge of the couture to attach the brocade. And I overlocked the edge of the brocade that would be folded into the facing. I press the front fold and cool it under weights. Then pin. Then I stitch down the front edge from the wrong side, and this will form one side of the front bone channel. Actually starting to put together the stays. It's pretty, so exciting. However, I pressed it again and it all puckered up. No! So it was time to unpick the top line of stitches with a seam ripper. I pressed it again, let it cool, and then re-stitched that top line. For the second front piece, I tried a different method. I firstly cut 2 inches from the front edge, then cut the fabric away from up above and pinned it loosely. I pressed the brocade and it did indeed shrink, so I moved the pins in and pressed it again and repeated this process until it was all nice and flat. Then I flat-lined the second front piece together. I pressed the front over and stitched down the centre front. I trimmed away the fabric at the side and overlocked that front edge at 3 centimetres to match the first front edge. Then folding all layers down, I stitched close to the centre front along the front edge. And with that, the 2 front panels have been flatlined. Hurrah! I really love the fabric. Such shine. So pretty. Now onto the rest of the pieces, broadly cutting out, then pinning down, starting with the straps, then the first back piece, and the stomacher, the second back piece, and then the side pieces. I steam pressed the pieces, adjusting the pins as required. The time had come for the rest of the flat lining. I started with the straps. And then continued onto the stomacher, and the side pieces, during which I incorporated stay stitching the tabs. This is an important step. The stitches will be visible on the right side of material, so we'll be able to follow them later when binding the tabs. Then flatlining and stay stitching the tabs on the back pieces. After overlocking, folding and pressing in the back edge, as I did for the front, I stitched closely along the centre back. Looking from the right side of the fabric, you can just see the stay stitches coming through. Unlike in the mock-up, I didn't want them to be too obvious on the real stays. And so all the pieces have now been prepared. In part 2 of this series, I will work through the assembly of the stays and the sewing of the bone channels. I hope you can join me then.
Hello and welcome back to the next video about making my 1780s front lacing stays.
So far in this stays project, I firstly made the mock-up, and I have a video about that. Then, in the part 1 video of the real stays, I prepared the pattern pieces, cut out the coutil, marked the required lines, cut out the brocade, and flatlined it to the coutil. Then stay stitched the tabs. We're now ready for the assembly. This video is part 2 in my adventure of sewing these 1780s stays. This video includes the stays assembly, arranging the layers to ensure the outer layer aligns with the inner one, and stitching the boning channels. And on we go. Here is a front piece, and here is a side piece. I line up the coutil parts of the outer layer, not the brocade, and pin them together, keeping the lining out of the way. Then I stitch with a 10mm seam allowance. Hurrah! First line of assembly is done. Next, I repeat this for the lining layer, which is easier as there is no brocade to get in the way this time. Here's where I start to deviate slightly from the instructions. I don't press the seams open, instead I press the outer layer seam towards the front and press the lining layer seam towards the back. Next, I top stitched both the outside and inside layers to their respective seam allowances along those pressed down edges. And then I trim down the excess brocade fabric. Off camera, I pinned the pieces together. Then I stitched in the ditch along the seam to join the layers. This is not traditional and not following the instructions, but this was my first pair of stays and I had limited time, so I used the techniques I'm familiar with from corsetry. This is then repeated for the other half, connecting the front to the sides, pressing the seams, top stitching, trimming down the brocade, pinning the layers together, and stitching in the ditch along the seam, joining the outer layer to the lining. And it's time for another little deviation from the instructions. I'm joining the back pieces on now, so I will be able to obtain a really smooth inside. I lined up the coutil edges of the side and back layer pieces, and then pinned them together. This was done for both sides. Then, ensuring that I don't have any layers caught underneath, I sew the seam for both sides with a 15mm seam allowance. I press this seam between the back and the side and the outer layer towards the back. and repeated for the second side. I top stitched the seam close to the edge, going slowly and gently pulling the fabric flat over the curve of the seam, trying to get it to sit smoothly. I trimmed down the brocade, trimming the different layers to different widths so as not to have any big bumps. The back lining piece was brought in and pressed. Then the raw edge of the coutil was folded under and pressed. Then left to cool under weights. At this point I was once again very worried about the fashion fabric shrinking, causing the coutil to wrinkle, but I decided to press on for now. So I pinned down the back lining, folded under the side lining so it sits under the folded edge of the back panel, and pinned down the side lining and the seam. Once the first side was done, I did it all again for the second side. The lining pieces will be secured by stitching in the ditch from the right side, sewing through all the layers of fabric. And it's time to sew, trying to stick as closely to the ditch of the seam as possible. So let's take a breath. The 3 pieces of each half are now joined together. I really enjoyed how it shines in different ways as you look at it from different angles. Viewing from the inside, we can see how the seams have come together, and we can see all the graphite lines ready for stitching the boning channels. Starting with the stomacher boning channels. After pinning the lining to the outer layer, I stitched around the lower edge to secure the layers. Then, as I did for the mock-up, it was time to go around and around, carefully following the lines, being sure not to cross a line, as that would obstruct a channel. Here is the stomacher from the outside. While the lines of stitching are purposefully matched to blend in as much as possible, you can make out the boning channels, and I'm really happy with how they came out. Before starting on the boning channels of the main stays, I needed to refill my bobbin, as there are a lot of lines of stitches in this project. And I freely admit that I really enjoy the automatic bobbin winder on my Janome 1600p QC. The stays feel floppy and soft at this stage as I commence sewing the boning channels to surround the grommets at the back. Sewing from the right side, I firstly sew 10 mm from the line of stitching at the edge. The channel for the grommets is 12 mm over from that. Then there's another line 10 mm over for the second bone. You're now seeing a closer look as I do the same for the front boning channels surrounding the grommets. I have rotated the piece around and I'm sewing from the bottom to the top. I'm happy to do this because we're on the straight grain, even though in general I always try to stitch top down for seams and top stitching. Once again, we space the lines at intervals of 10 mm, 12 mm and 10 mm. Switching to the other half of the stays, I stitched the third set of boning channels for the grommets, which are at the front of the stays for this half. Then the fourth and final set, which are at the back. At this point, I looked over how the fabric was sitting in general. I was happy with the tabs, but I realised that the brocade on the side pieces was still bunching up at the top, so I decided to unpick the top line of stay stitching, and that smoothed it out enough. After that, I trimmed away excess fabric from around the tabs. On to the rest of the boning channels, stitching from the inside of the stays to follow the marked lines, going round and around and around, trying to keep the layers nice and smooth. And with each line of stitching, the garment has a little more structure and a little less floppiness. I noticed that the transferred lines didn't always line up perfectly with the stay stitch tabs, so I adapted some of the lines slightly as I went. Next time, I think I might leave drawing the lines until this point. I tried to get as smooth a finish as possible, so I made sure not to backstitch or have knots in the middle of the stays. Instead, I stitched over lines already sewn for small sections so that I could just keep sewing forward. Once I made it through the first half of the stays, I continued on to the second. Eventually, all the boning channels were sewn. Thank you for watching. In part 3 of this series, I will add the boning, the binding, and the finishing touches. I hope you can join me then.
Hello and welcome to part 3 in how I made my 1780s stays. This is the final video in this little series, and we see the stays come to completion.
In my previous videos about making these stays, I have shown making my mock-up. Then for the real stays, I cut out the coutil and the brocade, flatlined the pieces, and then stay stitched the tabs. In the part 2 video, I firstly joined the front and side pieces, arranging the layers to ensure the outer layer aligned with the inner one. Then I joined on the back pieces, top stitched those seams, and the lining was folded over and stitched in the ditch to secure it in place. The channels for the grommets and for the flat steel bones that go either side of them were stitched from the outside of the garment. Then the rest of the boning channels were sewn from the inside of the stays. This video is part 3 and takes us to the end of making these stays. This includes cutting and inserting the bones in the lower section, using bias binding to bind the tabs, cutting and inserting the remainder of the bones, setting the grommets in for spiral lacing, and lacing up with ribbon, checking the final fit and adjusting as needed, and sewing bias binding along the upper edge and on the stomacher, finishing with attaching the straps. It's time to insert the first of the bones, starting with the 5 bones on each half of the stays that must be in before the tab binding can be done. I'm using 6 by 1.5mm synthetic whalebone, and to begin I make a tester rod to check the length of the bones required, inserting it into the bone channel and using a ruler to measure. I then measure off the length of bone required and cut it off. The corners are rounded and then filed. Then the bone is inserted into the stays. This process was repeated for each of the bones, and while I was taking care, I was also going for speed. I made these stays late last year and wanted to wear them for a student dance performance. The footage you're seeing now is from 6:30 AM on a Friday morning, 2 days before the performance on the Sunday evening, so it was full steam ahead. The process was repeated on the other half of the stays, and with those 10 bones in, I was almost ready to bind the tabs. The binding will follow the stay stitch lines at the bottom of the stays. But before I jump straight into sewing tabs, I ease into sewing on the bias binding by sewing around the lower edge of the stomacher. I firstly trim down the brocade, Then, being careful of the horizontal bone, I pin on the first few centimetres of the bias binding. I sew the bias onto the stomacher using my hands to position it. I fold the bias tape over to the wrong side and pin it thoroughly, starting at the curves at the bottom and then with lower pin density up the straight sides. I stitch in the ditch from the right side to secure the binding, trying not to stab myself. Then remove the stab sticks. Then it is time for the actual tab bias binding. Rather nerve-wracking. I pin on the bias to get it started. Then, using my hands to form the curves and lining the edge of the unfolded bias tape along the line of stay stitches, I ease it around. I marked the top of the tab with a pin to know how far to stitch, then ease the curve around to head back down on the other side. It's also important to ensure that the bones stay as far up in the channels as possible. You don't want to accidentally hit one with the needle. This was my first go at binding tabs, and it was definitely a learning curve. I recommend you read through Redthreaded's blog about tab binding, and I'll put the link in the description below. This was also done on the second side, slowly easing the bias binding around, keeping the edge aligned with the stitched, and stitching in the fold of the binding. With each tab, I got a little better. The curve at the bottom of the tabs was fiddly, but the tops of the tabs was mind-bending. Then it's time to trim around the tabs, cutting along the stay stitching lines, being very careful not to accidentally snip the bias binding. Then press the bias binding down around the curves and wrap the binding around the tabs. And press it again to get it to sit reasonably flat. Redthreaded don't use pins, but I couldn't get that to work. So I pinned the tops of the tabs just with 2 pins crossed and used clips to hold the bottom in place. Then I folded in the ends and pinned them as well. After backstitching to secure, I slowly stitch in the ditch around the bias binding, being careful that the pins don't get caught underneath. And removing the clips as I approach them. I used a 1.5mm stitch length and pivoted often when going around the curves. I realised that the bone channel on the inside of the grommets was partially blocked, so I completely sealed that off. And finished off the binding. I removed the pins and checked that all of the inside of the bias was caught down. And the tab binding is done. So here's where we're up to. The lower bones are in and the tabs are bound. It's far from perfect, but for a first attempt, I'm very happy. On to the rest of the bones. This is done with a slightly more production line procedure to make the most of the very limited time before I needed to wear these stays. Firstly, I measure each required bone length and record it on the pattern pieces, starting with the vertical bones in the stomacher, then the horizontal bones, and the centre front and back, which will be flat steel, and then all the rest. I cut 12mm wide synthetic whalebone for the centre of the stomacher and 6mm wide boning for the rest. Then I cut the synthetic whaleboning for the front piece, and the back and side pieces of the stays. Then it was time to go and have my hair done in preparation for the performance, for this was 2019, and at such a time, people could freely roam the streets of Melbourne. I arrived at Bouffant Delacroix on Saturday afternoon and was immediately treated to bubbles in a gorgeous teacup, setting the scene for an afternoon of indulgence. I trim and file all the bones for my stays as the charming Michael Davids works his magic. My hair is curled and teased and moulded into a glorious Marie Antoinette-inspired updo, all ready for the French fans' performance on the Sunday. Then, after a tram ride home where I looked completely normal and didn't get stared at all, I trim down the sides of the brocade and insert the bones, starting with the flat steel bones for either sides of the grommets, then the synthetic whale bones. It's getting so close to being done now. On Sunday morning, yes, the day of the performance, I work out and mark where the grommets need to be placed. I settle back into my armchair and then punch the holes for the grommets along the fronts and the backs. Then it's time for inserting the grommets, referring as ever to the notes I made after my first corset course with the wonderful Luana of Vanyanis. I widen the hole with an awl, then insert the first part of the grommet and push the fabric down to get it through properly. I put on the second part, being careful with orientation, and to ensure they're sitting properly in the plim pliers, I give them a wiggle, then squeeze to insert. After much wrist-tiring work, the first half is done. I repeat it all on the second side, and then all the grommets are done. I pin down the stays with a 2-inch lacing gap at the back, and then insert the ribbon in spiral lacing, trying to keep it flat and smooth. Next, I cut down the top edge of the brocade to match the coutil. And it's time to try it on. I'm very happy with the fit, just need to lower slightly under the arms, as was expected from the mock-up. Hurrah! And it's time to throw caution to the wind, As I have very limited time and want to lower the arm scythe, I remove the bones and cut. The bones are then trimmed, filed, and reinserted. Then the bias binding is attached to the top edge, in the same way as was described previously in the video, as was discussed in more detail and with better light when it wasn't the morning of the performance for which I wanted to wear these stays. The stomacher is similarly finished. Lastly, the straps. I trim down the brocade, pin two pieces together, and sew on bias binding. Then overlock on the short edge. Then sew the straps to the stays. I put in the final grommets for tying on the straps at the venue during the tech rehearsal and tied on the ribbons, and it was done just in time. The costume worked wonderfully for our fabulous French fans dance at Maison Burlesque's Cherry Poppers Showcase. A tip for wearing stays or a corset without a chemise: wear a singlet top and push the straps underneath. After suitable rest and recuperation, we also had a wonderful photo shoot day where I got to get all glammed up once again and have some beautiful photos taken of my garments by 42nd Street Photography at the Vamp studio at Maison Burlesque.
So here we are, my completed 1780s stays. I'm really happy with how they've turned out. There were a lot of hard work and not a huge amount of time to do them in, but I'm very happy with what I've got and look forward to getting lots of use out of them. Thank you for watching, and I hope you can join me again next time. Hello and welcome to the bum pad episode of my Arcadian Shepherdess sewing series. I used American Duchess's Simplicity 8162 pattern to make this bum pad.
Let's get started. I cut out the pattern piece at the same time that I cut out the chemise pattern pieces. The bum pad is made up of 2 layers of the main piece, as well as a ruffle, which is just a long rectangle so I didn't cut the pattern piece for that out. The bum pad was sewn using linen that was left over from making a shirt. As it was a slightly odd shape, I folded the linen into quarters long ways, so that I have 4 layers of fabric on the board. I laid out the bum pad pattern at the top on the fold, so I knew how much fabric was required for it. The pattern called for 3 strips for the ruffle, each 3.5 inches wide. As I wanted to use as much of my fabric as I could and had 21 inches available, I made them 7 inches wide. With the ruffle pieces out of the way, I weighed down and cut out the bum pad on the fold, so that unfolded I had 2 full pieces. And with that, the pieces were cut. The twill tape ties were pinned to the upper edges of the bum pad using 2 pins per tie to keep the tails going in the desired direction. Then I did a couple quick lines of stitches to hold the tapes in place. Then I moved to the overlocker and converted it to be set up for machine rolled hems. Removing the cutter, returning the covers, taking out one of the 2 needles, and then getting rid of the thread that was through it. I finished the bottom edge of the 3 pieces of the ruffle hem sewn on the overlocker. I did the 3 pieces separately, as I had learnt my lesson with the chemise, that if you join them first, it doesn't go through the rolled hem on the overlocker. Next, I also did a rolled hem on the 2 side edges. And switched back to normal overlocker mode. I joined up 2 pieces, then joined on the 3rd. Threads that would not be otherwise bound were tied off using an embroidery needle and threading through under the stitches a few times, then trimmed. With one final check along and removing of loose threads, the ruffle was in one piece. Along the top of the ruffle, I sew 5mm stitches for the first of the gathering lines. Then sew a second line parallel to it, keeping the first line of stitches the right side of the presser foot. I tied the ends of my two gathering lines together on each side and at each end. Then I pulled one set from each end to gather the ruffle until it's about the desired length. I find the middle point by placing the facing on it, folded in half, and pin the middle of the ruffle to the bum pad there. The ruffle is right side down, pinned to the lower edge of the right side of the bum pad. I pinned the center section first, then I finalized the length of the gather on one half and pinned it down. And then I did the same for the second side. The ruffle was then stitched onto the bum pad. The pattern called for basting, but I decided just to sew it and wrangle the fluffy thing through my machine. Before attaching the bum pad facing, I first pinned down the edges of the ruffle to keep it out of the way. I laid the facing over the outer layer of the bum pad, right sides together, sandwiching the ruffle. I pinned on the facing, starting at the inner corners to match them up, then working along the whole edge. I stitched the lower edges together, being careful to pivot at the inside corners. Then I removed the pins. Next, I clipped the curves, particularly at the inner corners. I turned the bum pad right side out I identified the stitching lines from the pattern and pinned them down. I was not too concerned about precision for this. The stitching lines were then sewn down. The edges had been pressed inwards, and the centre section has had some fibre fill inserted. The instructions said not to overfill it, but I didn't want it to be lacking. In retrospect, I wish I had put even more in, as the stuffing has settled over time. The upper edge was pinned closed, starting with key points to match up the layers, then filling in the gaps. And finally, I stitched the upper edge together. I wore the bum pad for my Arcadian Shepherdess undergarment photo shoot at Maison Burlesque. It's a lot of fun to bounce around in. And while it was covered by the under-petticoat in most of the photos, I do have this lovely shot of my partner and me, where the bum pad is visible.
And here we have my finished bum pad. I'm really happy with it, and I am glad that I made those ruffles a little bit longer to just aid the transition from big bum pad down to breast height. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you can join me next time when I move on to making the under petticoat that goes over this. Thanks for joining me. Goodbye. Hello and welcome to my Arcadian Shepherdess sewing series. In this video, I'll be showing how I made my under petticoat. I didn't use a pattern for this under petticoat, as it's a fairly simple garment. There are 3 meters of cotton voile in the main part of the skirt. 3 times that is 9 meters in the ruffle. I then pleated it all together and adjusted the height on Madam so that the hem is the same distance above the ground all the way around. This accounts for the bum pad. And then it gets pleated into the waistband.
The first step was to work out the dimensions that the under petticoat needed to be. So I got dressed in the layers that go underneath it: chemise, stays and bum pad. I measured my waist, then I wanted to understand the effect of the bum pad, so I took measurements at my front, side and back. I measured down to the ground with bare feet, looking in a mirror to be able to stand up straight. It was 118 centimeters over the sides and back, and 106 at the front. I'll discuss this more later. To determine how long I wanted the under petticoat to be, I pulled the tape measure up to the height I liked the look of. I decided I wanted it to be a total of 80 centimetres, and I broke that down into 5 centimetres for the waistband, 60 for the main skirt, and 15 for the ruffle. I measured 3 metres of fabric, and being cotton voile, it tore off easily. I folded it twice, so I'm then cutting through 4 layers at once. I cut at the 65 centimetre mark for the main skirt, 60 centimetres plus 5 for the seam allowance. That left me with 60 centimetres, so I cut 3 ruffles at 20 centimetres each, which gives me plenty for the seam allowance. And finally, I tore off a strip for the waistband. I used my overlocker to sew rolled hems on the ruffle pieces. Have a look at my bum pad video for more details about the settings and procedures that I use for machine rolled hems. After converting back to normal overlocker mode, I serged the back edges of the main skirt piece, which will make up the back seam. I overlocked the ruffle pieces, right sides together, to join into one long 9-metre ruffle. Each time I started at the rolled hem to ensure it was level. An embroidery needle was employed to deal with any threads on the hem. Next, I put in the gathering lines on the top edge of the ruffle. I purposefully broke the lines down into being on each piece of fabric, so that it wasn't one giant 9-metre line of gathering, but 3 separate ones. I did all 3 first lines, and then I did the second set of parallel lines. Then I was back to the cutting board. I wanted to pleat the under-petticoat into 1/3 of its original size, using inch-wide pleats. This was an easy option as it meant there were 3 layers of fabric everywhere, so I just needed to fold under until I reached the last fold, and follow the inch lines of the cutting board beneath. I used a fork as that was a technique I had heard about and wanted to try, but I'm not sure it was any easier than just folding by hand in this case. The next step was to adjust the height of the under-petticoat so that the hem would be level accounting for the bum pad. So let's go back to the measurements we took earlier. At the front, it's 106 centimetres from the waist to the floor. At the side, it's 118 centimetres. And at the back, it is also 118 centimetres. The key point is that the front is 12 centimetres shorter than the sides and the back. So let's get back to the cutting board. We have the centre front of the under-petticoat and the sides and the back. The sides at the back need the same length, so the waistline can follow along the top there. Between the sides and the front, the waistline dips down to 12 centimetres below the top of the fabric. I pinned the altered waistline on the board following this red line. Then I checked how the waistline sat on Madam, my dress form. I was fairly happy, and it seemed even at the hem. So I decided to press on and sew it. The next step was to secure the waistline by sewing along it. Back on the cutting board, I trimmed down the top of the front. Then I pinned on the waistband. I realised that I should have adjusted the pleats more on Madam to get the angles of them to sit smoothly and vertically. But this was my first attempt, and I was on a time crunch to get the under-petticoat finished before my photo shoot. That's the benefit of working skin out. Your mistakes can happen on the underlayers, and then you know better for next time. I then stitched the waistband to the skirt of the under-petticoat. And removed the top line of pins. The waistband was folded over and pinned down. And the ends were folded in and pinned. I stitched in the ditch to finish attaching the waistband. Then removed all pins. We went away for the weekend to celebrate the wedding of friends and stayed at a delightful guest house. I took my under-petticoat along on the trip and basted the 9 meters of ruffle into place. The waistband is over my knees and I'm working on the bottom edge. I start with 1/3 of the ruffle, gently pulling 3 meters down to 1 meter. I hand stitch the ruffle to the petticoat with long running stitches, repeating the process of gathering and stitching down for the other 2/3 of the ruffle as well. One benefit of basting is that I don't have to wrangle a huge line of pins and ruffles through the machine. Another benefit is that the basting is enough to get through a photo shoot when on a short deadline. After some time, the ruffle was attached. I threaded the ribbon through the waistband using a safety pin to pull it through. The inside seam was, eventually, finished neatly by overlocking. I must admit, it can be a little awkward getting the under-petticoat on over the bum pad, but it's lots of fun to play around in. I was really happy with the beautiful images that 42nd Street Photography took during the photo shoot at the Vamp studio at Maison Burlesque.
And here we are. My under-petticoat is finished. I'm reasonably happy with it, but one takeaway learning I have for the actual outer petticoat is to adjust the pleats at the top here, because I'm not completely happy with them. But overall, I'm pretty happy. I've got the hem reasonably flat. And that was the big aim. Plus, it's floofy fun. Hello and welcome to this video about tie-on pockets. I recently bought the book The Pocket, A Hidden History of Women's Lives. Its arrival was very well timed, as I'm up to editing the footage of sewing my Arcadian Shepherdess pair of pockets. Tie-on pockets were commonly used from the 17th to late 19th century. Clothing often didn't have the sort of built-in pockets that we think of, so people wore these tie-on pockets either singly or in pairs. They were often plain linen or cotton, but they were also embroidered or decorated with applique, made out of patchwork or fine silk. They were worn around the waist, attached by ties, and had a slit to access the contents. They could be worn as an outer layer for quick access, particularly useful when selling wares, or could be worn underneath your petticoats to be more concealed and private. I'm going to start by showing you how I made my pockets, and then come back and discuss the book.
I made my 1780s stays out of a beautiful gold and ivory brocade. When cutting out my stays, I had some fabric left over, and I realized that would be perfect for making a pair of pockets. To get a feel for what I wanted, I tied my older red pockets onto Madame over my Arcadian Shepherdess underthings. I decided that I wanted them a little bit longer and rounded. After selecting the desired parts of the fabric to get the swirl where I wanted it, and cutting the pockets out, the first thing I did was insert the pocket openings. I don't have footage of the real ones, so will momentarily show you the process on a sample. The first step is to draw a line where you want the pocket opening to be. Okay. And we have our bias binding, and I'm just going to pin it in a couple of places. So just start a few pins at the top to get it started, and then we'll manipulate the rest by hand when we're at the sewing machine. Sew along the fold line, removing pins as you go. Then carefully rotating around the bottom, stopping and adjusting as often as necessary. Once attached, we can snip off the end of the bias binding, as we now know how much was needed. We can see the bias binding is now sewn down, and we turn it around, ready to cut along that opening. Either side of this line, chopping out a little bit. Go in here. Chopping around there. Okay, from there we'll check when that folds over.
there, and that folds over. Yep, we can cover that line of stitches with the double layer. So that looks good. Let's do that. Okay, so we've got this one.
Stitch in the ditch to sew down the bias binding.
Okay, so here we are with the pins in. Let's take them out. Okay, so this is what they look like so far, and it is really quite nice and round. Here has now been pressed. You can see we've stitched in the ditch all the way around, and from the back, this is what that looks like. We've caught down the edge all the way around, and it's formed a nice round loop, which is lovely. It's a little bit scrunched and gathered there. That's okay. There's not much you can do about that. You can try and do it more. If you tried to do it with corners, you could have mitered corners, but I'm okay with this. It presses down fine.
So now we're back to the real pockets, which have the pocket opening sewn and the curve for the bottom stitch line drawn. I did French seams on these, but upon reading the book realised I had included more doubling up than was necessary, as we shall see. Both pockets were then sewn, wrong sides together, along that outside line of the pocket. The one on the right has also been trimmed and had notches cut. Then the pockets were turned inside out, right sides together, and sewn, with a 10mm seam allowance where there is a French seam, and 7mm when it is just on the fold. If I had started right sides together and used an even seam allowance, this would then be done, with the stitching visible around the edges on the outside, but I had automatically aimed for the seam to be on the inside, as we see on the right. The tops were trimmed straight and neat. The fronts and backs of each pocket were pleated at the top, and the pocket openings overlapped and pinned down. They were then pinned onto the waistband, the spacing simply done by aligning the middle of each pocket with that of the red pair. The waist tape was secured with 2 lines of stitches. The final step is to bind the top edge with blanket binding, using a similar process to the bias binding that we put around the pocket opening. And just pinning it down so this is along the same line, and then also just on that side. The blanket binding is then folded over, pinned in place, and top stitched. And with that, the pockets are complete.
And here we have them, my finished pockets. I'm really happy with how they came out. I can put things in them, move my hands around. So now let's get on to the book review. The Pocket, A Hidden History of Women's Lives, by Barbara Berman and Ariane Fennetal. So firstly, what I expected going in was that this book would have lots of pictures of pockets, with lots of descriptions, and some context and social history about them as well. What I found was that while there really are many beautiful pictures, the emphasis was more on the social history. The authors used this object, the pocket, as a lens through which to examine the lives and context of women in Britain from the late 17th to late 19th century. It is about so much more than pockets. Before starting the book, in my mind, pockets belonged to the 18th century and before. I was surprised to learn that pockets continued to be used throughout the Regency period and beyond, and they sometimes got longer to accommodate the higher waistlines. They were not considered a fancy item, but just a standard everyday part of life. They were certainly not as fashionable as the reticule, or ridicule as they were sometimes called, but they were considered far more practical. I was very excited to see the example they have on page 41 of what they describe as a woman's quilted silk waist with a matching pair of pockets. It's quite a similar idea to what I did, matching my pockets to my stays. It should be noted that I found the book quite heavy to read in places, written in a very scholarly style. If you are hoping to find a catalogue of different pockets with style and construction information all clearly laid out together, then you're out of luck. Chapter 2 does focus on making and getting pockets, but ultimately the information is dispersed throughout the book. Furthermore, you can get a bit lost. It's hard to flick through and know what that page is about. Chapter names are not printed on each page and are not completely clear anyway. But time for more positives. There are many beautiful pictures of wonderful pockets throughout this book, with very clear references. It is full of very interesting social history. It is remarkably well researched and supported by evidence. And I do want to clarify, it does have many specific examples, pictures and descriptions of various types of pocket construction, but is not laid out with the purpose of a guide to reconstructing one's own. Pockets ranged from simple and sturdy to elaborately embroidered and decorated. And apparently there was a particular trend in Wales to embroider your name onto your pocket. In conclusion, there is a lot of very interesting information in this book, and I enjoyed it very much. Overall, I give it a rating of 4.5 out of 5 stars, as I do think it could be a little easier to navigate. Please let me know in the comments if you have read The Pocket and what you thought of it. Did you have a favourite pocket that you are now inspired to make? Also, if you have made your own pair of pockets, I'd love to hear how you find them and what stylistic choices you made. If you enjoyed this video, please consider clicking the like button and subscribing. Thank you for watching. I hope you will join me next time. Goodbye. Hello and welcome to the next video in my Arcadian Shepherdess series. In this video, I look at how I made the petticoat, this one here, with ivory satin and gold lace.
As I was working from stash fabric as much as possible, I only had enough of the ivory satin to make the front and ruffle pieces. So for the wider back piece, I used a white satin, which will not be visible in the final outfit. So let's start from the start. I laid out my first piece of the ivory satin and trimmed to neaten. I cut off the main front panel, then I cut the remaining into 3 strips for the ruffle. I also had a second, smaller piece of the material, from which I cut 2 more ruffle strips, and saved the leftover to be used in the stomacher, plus a little for practice. Then to the white satin for the back. I measured 2 meters for the desired width, and then tore it off. Then I trimmed it to the desired length. I overlocked the sides of the back piece to bind the edges. I pinned the ruffle pieces right sides together, 2 pieces for the front and 3 pieces for the back. Then sewed them up to make longer ruffles. I pressed the ruffle seams open and top stitched the ruffle joins. This was to get the fabric to sit flat, so I wasn't too concerned with the look, as the front ruffle will have lace over the top and the back ruffle will be covered by the outer gown. Next, I overlocked the bottom edge of both ruffles. Folding the ruffle hem under, I top stitched. Then pressed it flat. I laid out my narrower piece of gold lace onto the front ruffle and pinned it down, starting at the middle and working towards the edges. I stitched the lace down onto the ruffle, starting with the bottom edge. The overall process of lace attachment took 2 hours according to my notes, so be sure to have a good audiobook or some such to hand. Then sewing around the top edge of the lace, trying to get each nook and cranny secure. And so it was attached. To make the ruffles, I switched to a ruffle foot. I more usually gather, but I wanted to try this technique. I tried a few test pieces to determine the desired setting, then ruffled the back ruffle, and then the front ruffle. I pinned the back ruffle to the back panel, and the front ruffle to the front panel. Note that I started in the middle and worked outwards, and for the front one, I pinned both sides of the ruffle to hold it neatly in place. I stitched the ruffles down, then I overlocked to bind the edges. I also overlocked the sides of the ruffles to cut them off to the correct length. I then top stitched to help it sit flat. Then it was time to pin the wider piece of gold lace onto the bottom of the front panel. I aligned the bottom of the lace to sit just over the top of the ruffle. This lace was then stitched on in the same manner as the lace on the ruffle. Time to pleat. I secured the panel along the centre front line. Then I used the fact that I could see through my fabric to the 1-inch lines on the cutting board to bring the panel to 1/3 of the original size using 1-inch pleats. I secured the pleats using multiple pins. I pinned the front panel onto Madam, my dummy. I adjusted the sides so that they sat with the hem 20 centimetres from the floor. Then pulled up the waist so that the hem sat at 20 centimetres all the way along, and repinned the waistline. Then I tweaked the way the pleats were falling, and secured that by changing the angle at the waist. Then I pinned on the herringbone waist tape. I put the first line of stitches along the top edge of the waistband. The waist tape was folded towards the inside and pinned down. Then top stitched near the upper edge. The excess fabric was trimmed. Then the waist tape was pinned down, enclosing the raw edge, and top stitched to secure. I repeated the pleating process for the back, continuing the direction of the pleats being towards the back. I attached the waist tape straight across, as the sides and back have the same distance from the waist to the floor. Laying the pieces right sides together, the final step was to join the front to the back, sewing from the hem and stopping 25 centimeters from the waist. Then I top stitched around the openings where we have the pocket access point. With that, the petticoat was done. And the slits at the side allow easy access to the pockets.
And my petticoat is complete. I'm really happy with how it's come out. I love the material that the front section and the ruffle is made out of. The gold lace has just done exactly what I wanted it to do. And I'm really happy with how the pleats sit. Thank you for watching, and I hope you can join me next time when I move on to the gown. Hello and welcome to this video, which is about how I made the stomacher for my Arcadian Shepherdess gown. I used Simplicity Pattern 8161, the American Duchess 18th century costume.
The main gown will be its own video, so please ignore any gown construction here. I decided to embellish the front of the gown with robings and pin on a decorative stomacher outside the lacing. To that end, I had to cut down the stomacher to my desired size. On the right is the original from the pattern, on the left is my cut down version. On the fold, I cut out a lining layer from linen. The linen was also used to line the gown bodice. I cut bias strips of satin to bind the edges of the stomacher, the same satin as was used in the petticoat. Then I laid out the linen as a template and cut out the stomacher satin layer. I didn't quite have enough couture for the two strength layers, but I wanted to stick to using up scraps, so I made do. The edges will have lots of layers, with the satin outer, linen inner, bias binding, and one full couture layer. And a stomacher doesn't take the strain in the way a corset does. So I marked it out using the correct half of the cardboard pattern pieces, then cut it out. I had my 4 layers and started to consider the lace placement, the same lace as on the petticoat. While I mould, I drew the bone channels onto the full couture layer. I pinned the lace onto the satin where I wanted it to be. As the lace was not completely symmetrical, it required artful placement rather than scientific. Then I cut off the excess from the sides. With that, all the layers were prepared. I pinned together the couture layers, then stitched the bone channels with 1.5mm stitches. The linen lining layer was pinned to the couture, then basted along all but the top edge. I measured and cut the bones. Then rounded the ends and inserted them into the stomacher. I gave the whole thing a steamy press to flatten the bones before we get to the lace. The gold lace was stitched onto the satin, as I had done for the petticoat, going around the whole outline of the lace. I trimmed the edge of the lace where a gold bauble was sitting. I laid the satin and lace layer over the main body of the stomacher and pinned them together. Then I stitched around the edges to hold them in place, and trimmed down the satin and lace to match the couture. The next step was to pin on the bias binding to the lower part. The bias binding was sewn on using a zipper foot, taking care around the gold baubles in the lace. After removing the pins, I flipped the bias binding to the outside and pressed it. Then it was a matter of folding it under on the reverse side and pinning it down. I started symmetrically, securing the bottom on both sides, then working up each side. I flipped it over again and stitched in the ditch. Then removed the pins. Time to finish the upper edge. I trimmed it down Reinserted the bones, and basted along the edge to hold things together. I pinned on the bias binding and stitched it on. Then proceeded as before and stitched in the ditch to secure.
And here we have the finished stomacher. Ta-da! I'm really happy with how it's come out. The lovely gold lace on ivory satin to match the petticoat. You can see it's pinned onto my stays currently, but it will be pinned on to the gown over the lacing. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you'd care to, please like and subscribe, and next time I'll be moving to the gown itself. Hello and welcome to the final video in the Arcadian Shepherdess series, where I complete my 18th century inspired gown. For this project, I used Simplicity pattern 8161, the American Duchess 18th century costume. This is not a historically accurate pattern, but that's fine, as I'm going for historically and fantastically inspired.
Firstly, I cut out the pattern pieces, the front and back of the skirt, the sleeve and sleeve ruffle, the bodice back, side back and front, and the stomacher, about which I have a separate video. I cut out mock-up pieces of the bodice part of the gown. Each piece had the pattern marked on it and was cut leaving plenty of room for adjustments. I added some length and width to the sleeve as the paper pattern was too small. I pinned together the mock-up pieces. And stitch them together with the sewing machine. I left the shoulder seams open for the fitting process.
Time to fit the mock-up for the overgown. I have sewn together the bodice sections, so the back sides and the front, as per the pattern pieces, and overall I'm really happy with how well they fit. Bear in mind that I did cut extra allowance in case I needed to let things out, but I think really once I fold things up away from the seam allowance of where it's meant to be, it's going to fit really well. There's just sort of one area where I want to change it, and that's tweaking it along the front. So this this orange highlighter line is going to be my new edge of the garment. So note for future self, this is the edge of the garment. So yeah, really happy with that. And here is the mock-up of the bodice with one sleeve kind of on. Overall, I think I'm happy with what I've drafted for the sleeve, adding in that extra room. It is perhaps a bit loose. I might perhaps take a centimetre out either side. and I'm going to remove an inch from the middle where I added that there. But overall, I'm happy with that.
I unpicked the mock-up and drew my adjusted pattern pieces on pattern material. With that, the pattern was ready to start on the final gown. For my outer fabric, I used a lovely wool blend with gold stripes running through it. I laid out my pattern pieces so that the sleeves were on grain, the sleeve frill used the selvage edge, and the bodice pieces would have the stripes at a 30-degree angle. Then I cut out the pieces. Here are the pieces cut out. You can see the sparkle in the gold lines. I laid out the front skirt pieces and cut them 10 centimeters shorter than the pattern. Next, I cut a straight panel for the 2 back skirt pieces. The fabric wasn't wide enough to cut it with the fabric folded, and I wanted to save the selvages for trim. I laid out the pattern and cut it out. Finally, I cut the lining pieces from a lovely linen. I stay stitched around the neckline and down the front. I pinned the back seam, lining up the stripes, and stitched. Then I pinned, then stitched the side back seams and overlocked each of the seams. I also added the front panels in the same way, then top stitched the seams to the side. Then I joined the shoulder seams. In a similar fashion, I assembled the bodice lining, overlocked the lining seams, and top stitched. I also overlocked the bottom edge of the lining and the bottom edge of the bodice. I also assembled the lining and outer layers of the sleeves. Then it was time to attach the lining and the outer bodice together. I pinned along the neck and front. I sewed along the centre front, leaving a significant seam allowance to provide support for the eyelets, then up and around the neckline, and down the other side. I clipped the seam and pressed it over a ham. I had a quick look at it on Madame, my dress form, and decided the neckline was a bit high and boxy for my liking. So I brought it down a bit and was much happier.
Okay, so here we have the bodice pinned on. There will be a skirt that comes down over the top all here. I think it fits really well.
Onto the skirt. I overlocked the edges and the centre back seam, being sure to remove all pins as I went. I lined up the back panel to a front panel and pinned to the bottom of the pocket opening. I sewed the seams, and after pressing them open, I top stitched around the pocket openings. I used strong Resant thread to gather the top of the skirt, picking up a stitch at each gold stripe. Then I pinned the gathered skirt to the fashion layer of the bodice. Sewed it down and overlocked to secure it. And while the stripes don't sit quite as I had hoped, they are adequate. The next task was top stitching the bodice. Firstly, I stitched along the neckline, then down the centre back and either side to create boning channels. I turned under the bottom of the lining and pinned it, then top stitched the bone channels at the front of the bodice. I cut bones to length, and after shaping the ends, I inserted the bones into the channels. Then I top stitched along the waist to secure the lining. And while Madam isn't wearing the proper undergarments, this does give an idea about how the skirt is attached. Let's get back to the sleeves. There's the outer fabric, the lining, and the ruffles. After joining the ruffles into loops, I sewed gathering lines along the cut edge, keeping the selvages to be the hem. I gathered the ruffles and pinned them onto the outer fabric of the sleeve, then stitched it down. Next, I inserted the sleeve into the lining. Then stitched again and overlocked, turned out and top stitched. I also stitched the outer and the lining together around the top of the sleeve, and with that, the sleeves are ready to insert into the bodice. I pinned a sleeve in, matching up the bottom section and putting in pleats in the top. Then it was sewn. Then I trimmed down all but the lining of the sleeve seam. I folded it over and pinned it down, then stitched it by hand. Next, I marked the placement for the lacing holes onto the front of the bodice. Punched the holes, and inserted the eyelets, set up for spiral lacing. I also made some covers onto which the trim will be sewn to cover the eyelets. The final stage was the trim. I cut out strips of my gold striped wool blend. I folded in the raw edge. I gathered the trim and pressed it. I stitched down narrow pieces along the edges of the eyelet covers. Stitched the eyelet covers to the gown, then pinned down the long trim in a wavy pattern on the bodice, hiding the edge of the eyelet cover, and then down the edge of the skirt. Once stitched, the gown was complete.
So here is the overgown. So next I'm going to pin in the stomacher. So the stomacher is pinned in along the sides. Next I want to pin closed the front of the dress. And there we are. So here we are. My Arcadian Shepherdess costume is complete. I've really enjoyed making this project and I hope you've enjoyed watching it. Thanks for joining me. I'd love to hear about any Arcadian Shepherdess or more generally 18th century projects that you have. If you are thinking of sewing a gown, what sort of trim would you use? Feel free to leave a comment and I'd love to hear. Thanks for joining me. Goodbye.